At the Grand Royal Hotel, billionaire Hater Albuquerque basks in success until a child's voice shatters the celebration. "Dad, you forgot me." A boy in rags stands before him, exposing a past Hater buried. Will his empire survive the truth? Before we begin, comment below where you're watching from. The Grand Royal Hotel sparkled with crystal chandeliers, the marble floors reflecting the elegant steps of the guests. Men in tuxedos clinked champagne glasses, while women in designer dresses laughed in hushed conversations. In the center of the ballroom, under the spotlights, Hater Albuquerque, one of the country's most influential businessmen, stood on the stage. "Today we celebrate a new milestone in the history of the Albuquerque Group," Hater announced with pride, his voice echoing through the speakers. Applause filled the room. Cameras captured every second. Hater, with his impeccable posture and calculating gaze, was the very picture of success. Then a shout cut through the luxury of the night. "Dad, you forgot me!" The ballroom fell silent. Everyone turned toward the sound. A boy, dirty, with torn clothes and bare feet, had somehow gotten past security. His hair was disheveled, and his wide eyes mixed anger and desperation. He was trembling, but his voice carried the weight of years of pain. Hater froze. The color drained from his face. "It's me, Dad. You abandoned me for money," the guests began to whisper. Some women covered their mouths in shock. The press, alert to every detail, raised their phones to capture the moment. The billionaire tried to compose himself. "Security!" he ordered, his voice colder than he intended. But before the men could act, the boy stepped forward. "Look at me," his voice broke. "I'm your son. You promised you'd come back." Those words hit Hater like a knife. He remembered. Pedro. The son he had left behind 8 years ago when he traded a simple life for his limitless ambition. He had sworn he would return, but he never did. Because it was easier to forget than to face the guilt, and now facing the accusing gaze of his own blood, everything he had built seemed meaningless. Pedro didn't want money, luxury, or empty apologies. He just wanted to know why. Why was he abandoned? Why wasn't he enough? The billionaire closed his eyes, feeling the weight of what he had done. And then, in front of everyone, he stepped down from the stage. Complete silence. Hater knelt in front of the boy. His voice, choked with emotion, came out in a whisper. "Forgive me, son." Pedro's pent-up tears exploded. And in that ballroom where wealth defined everything, the embrace of a father and son was the most valuable thing anyone could witness. The scandal made headlines the next morning. "Billionaire confronted by abandoned son" was plastered across every newspaper and news website in the country. The video of their emotional reunion had gone viral overnight. Miranda Albuquerque, Hater's wife of 5 years, paced back and forth in their penthouse living room, her designer heels clicking angrily against the marble floor. "How could you keep this from me?" she demanded, throwing a tabloid newspaper at him. "A son? All these years and you never thought to mention you had a son?" Hater sat on the white leather couch, his head in his hands. "It was before I met you, Miranda. I was a different man then." "Different? You were a father," she shouted. "Where has this boy been all this time? And his mother? Is she going to show up next?" Hater looked up, his eyes red from a sleepless night. "Sophia died 3 years ago. Cancer. Pedro has been living with his grandmother in a small town near the coast. I didn't know Sophia had died until yesterday." Miranda stopped pacing. "So what now? You're just going to bring this dirty street kid into our home, into our life? What will people say?" "I don't care what people say," Hater replied, standing up. "He's my son. I abandoned him once. I won't do it again." Before Miranda could respond, the doorbell rang. Hater's assistant, Clara, entered the penthouse with Pedro beside her. The boy was clean now, wearing new clothes that Clara had bought for him, but his eyes still held that mixture of hope and distrust. "Mr. Albuquerque, I've brought Pedro as you asked," Clara said softly. Miranda looked at the boy with cold eyes. "I'll be at my sister's," she announced, grabbing her purse and walking out without another word. When they were alone, Hater knelt again to be at eye level with his son. Pedro, this is going to be your home now. I know it's not what you're used to, but where's all Grandma's things? Pedro interrupted. My photos with Mom. Heitor felt a stab of guilt. We'll get them, I promise. Your grandmother, is she okay with you staying with me? Pedro's eyes welled up with tears. She died last month. That's why I came looking for you. The neighbors were going to send me to an orphanage. Heitor pulled his son into a tight embrace, feeling the boy's small body shake with sobs. I'm so sorry, Pedro, for everything. I promise I'll never leave you again. At the Albuquerque Group headquarters, tensions were running high. Ricardo Mendez, Heitor's right-hand man and childhood friend, was trying to control the damage to the company's reputation. The board is demanding an emergency meeting, Ricardo informed Heitor over the phone, and our biggest investors are getting nervous. The company's stock has already dropped 5% since this morning. Tell them I'll meet with everyone tomorrow. Heitor replied, Today I'm spending time with my son. Ricardo sighed. Heitor, I understand, but no buts, Ricardo. I've missed 8 years of his life. The company can wait one more day. After hanging up, Heitor took Pedro to the kitchen where the chef had prepared lunch for them. This place is huge, Pedro said, his eyes wide as he looked around. Do you live here all alone? Well, there's Miranda, my wife, and we have staff, the chef, housekeepers, and security. Pedro pushed his food around on his plate. Do you have other kids? Heitor shook his head. No, you're my only son. Did you ever think about me? Pedro asked, his voice small. Heitor felt his throat tighten. Every day, he admitted, I told myself I was making a better life for us, that one day I'd come back for you and your mother. But then weeks turned into months and months into years. I got caught up in building the business and then I met Miranda, and I was a coward, Pedro. I was afraid to face what I had done. Mom waited for you, Pedro said, his eyes fixed on his plate. She always said you'd come back someday. Even when she got sick, she believed it. Tears slid down Heitor's cheeks. I should have been there for her, for both of you. She kept all your letters, Pedro continued. She read them to me even when I was too little to understand. But after a while they stopped coming. Heitor remembered those early letters, full of promises about the future they would have once he made his fortune. Promises he never kept. I can't change the past, Heitor said, reaching across the table to take his son's hand. But I promise you, from this day forward, you're my priority. Nothing else matters more than making up for lost time. Pedro looked up, meeting his father's gaze. There was still hurt there, still distrust, but also a glimmer of hope. Later that afternoon, Miranda returned to the penthouse with her sister, Victoria. They found Heitor and Pedro in the living room, looking through a photo album that Clara had brought from Pedro's grandmother's house. We need to talk, Miranda said coldly. Victoria, can you show the boy around? His name is Pedro, Heitor corrected, and he's not going anywhere. Anything you have to say, you can say in front of him. Miranda's perfectly made-up face tightened, with anger. Fine, I've spoken with my lawyer. If you insist on bringing this situation into our marriage, I want a revised prenuptial agreement. I will not allow some backwater kid to threaten my financial security. Is that all you care about? Money? Heitor asked, standing up. Pedro is my son, my blood. He's just lost his grandmother, the only family he had left after his mother died. And you're worried about your financial security. Victoria stepped forward. Come on, Pedro, let's go see the view from the balcony while they talk. Pedro didn't move. Are you going to send me away because of her? He asked Heitor, his voice trembling. No, Heitor said firmly. Never, this is your home now. Miranda laughed bitterly. You've known this boy for one day, and you're ready to risk everything for him? What about us? What about the life we've built together? What life, Miranda? Heitor shot back. We live in the same house, but we're strangers. When was the last time we had a real conversation? When was the last time you looked at me and saw the man, not the bank account? Miranda's face flushed with fury. How dare you? I've been the perfect wife. I've hosted your parties, charmed your clients, been by your side at every gala and charity event. I've done everything you asked of me. Except love me, Heitor said quietly. Or let me love you. The room fell silent. Victoria shifted uncomfortably. while Pedro watched the adults with wide, uncertain eyes. Finally, Miranda straightened her shoulders. "I'll have my things moved out by tomorrow. My lawyer will be in touch." She turned to leave, then looked back at Pedro. "For what it's worth, boy, I hope he doesn't abandon you twice." After Miranda and Victoria left, Heitor sat back down next to Pedro, who looked shaken by what had just happened. "I'm sorry you had to see that," Heitor said. Pedro shrugged. "Are you sad she's leaving?" Heitor thought about it. "No," he answered honestly. "I think our marriage ended a long time ago. We just didn't want to admit it." "Was it because of me?" Pedro asked, his voice small again. "No, son. It was because we married for the wrong reasons. I was lonely, and she wanted the status of being a billionaire's wife. That's not enough to build a life on." Pedro nodded, seeming to understand more than a child his age should. "What happens now?" Heitor put his arm around his son's shoulders. "Now we get to know each other. I have 8 years of catching up to do, and tomorrow I have to face my company and the board of directors. They're not happy about all this." "Will you lose your company?" Pedro asked, worried. "I might," Heitor admitted, "but if that's the price for getting you back in my life, it's worth it." As the afternoon turned to evening, father and son continued looking through the photo album, with Heitor asking questions about each picture, learning about the years of his son's life that he had missed. For the first time in many years, Heitor felt something real stirring in his heart, something more valuable than all the wealth he had accumulated. And as Pedro finally fell asleep that night in one of the penthouse's many guest rooms, Heitor stood in the doorway watching him, making a silent vow that no matter what happened tomorrow, his son would always come first from now on. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse as Heitor adjusted, his tie in the mirror. Today was the emergency board meeting, and he knew it wouldn't be easy. The company's stock had dropped another 3% overnight. In the kitchen, Pedro sat at the island counter, picking at his breakfast. He was wearing one of the new outfits Clara had bought for him, but he still looked uncomfortable in the expensive clothes. "Do I have to go to school?" Pedro asked when Heitor entered the kitchen. Heitor poured himself a cup of coffee. "Not yet. We need to find the right school first. For today, Clara will stay with you. She'll help you settle in." Pedro nodded, relief washing over his face. "Will you come back?" he asked, his eyes revealing his fear of abandonment. Heitor set down his coffee cup and placed both hands on his son's shoulders. "I will always come back to you, Pedro. Always. I promise." The boy gave a small smile, but Heitor could see he wasn't entirely convinced. Trust would take time to build. "I have an idea," Heitor said, pulling out his phone. "This is my private number. If you need me for anything at all, just call. I'll answer no matter what." Pedro took the phone, entering the number into the new cell phone Heitor had given him. "Even if you're in an important meeting." "Especially then," Heitor assured him, ruffling his hair. The Albuquerque Group headquarters occupied the top floors of a gleaming skyscraper in the financial district. As Heitor's private elevator ascended, he mentally prepared for the battle ahead. Ricardo was waiting for him when the doors opened. "It's bad, Heitor. The board is out for blood." "Let them try," Heitor replied, straightening his shoulders. "I built this company from nothing. They can't push me out." Ricardo looked uncertain. "Don't be so sure. Victoria called Eduardo last night." Heitor stopped walking. Eduardo Santos was the second largest shareholder in the company and had always been jealous of Heitor's success. Miranda's sister called Eduardo? Why? To warn him about Pedro. She suggested that having a scandal-ridden CEO with a suddenly discovered, illegitimate child might not be good for business. Heitor's jaw tightened. "Pedro is not illegitimate. I was with Sofia for 3 years. We just never married." "That distinction won't matter to the board," Ricardo warned as they approached the conference room. "They're business people, not family counselors." Inside, 12 men and women in expensive suits sat around a large oval table. Eduardo Santos, a silver-haired man with cold eyes, sat at the far end, directly opposite Heitor's chair, a symbolic challenge to his leadership. "Shall we begin?" Eduardo suggested with a thin smile. For the next hour, Heitor defended himself against a barrage of accusations and concerns. The board members questioned his judgment, his commitment to the company, and even his mental stability. "This child could be anyone," one board member argued. "Have you even done a DNA test?" "I don't need a test." "I know my son," Heitor responded firmly. "The public perception is what matters," Eduardo interjected smoothly. "Our investors are concerned. We've lost nearly 8% of our stock value in just 24 hours. Can we afford more losses because of your personal drama?" Heitor stood up, placing his hands on the table. "Let me be clear. Pedro is my son. He will be a part of my life from now on. If that makes any of you uncomfortable, I suggest you sell your shares and invest elsewhere." Eduardo exchanged glances with several board members. "Perhaps it would be best if you took a leave of absence, Heitor, just until this situation stabilizes." "A leave of absence?" Heitor laughed incredulously. "This is my company." "You own 40% of the shares," Eduardo corrected. "The rest of us collectively own more. If put to a vote today, I believe you would find yourself outnumbered." Ricardo stepped forward. "Let's not be hasty. Heitor has led this company to record profits 5 years running. One PR challenge doesn't erase that track record." A tense silence filled the room as the board members considered this. Finally, one of the older members spoke up. "I propose a compromise. Heitor remains as CEO, but we bring in a PR team to manage this situation. The boy should be properly introduced to society. A press conference, perhaps. Show that we're embracing this as development." Heitor felt his anger rising. "My son is not a situation to be managed. He's an 8-year-old boy who just lost his grandmother and is trying to adjust to a new life." "Then adjust quickly," Eduardo said coldly, "because this company won't wait forever." The meeting ended with an uneasy truce. Heitor would remain as CEO, but a special committee would be formed to monitor the company's public image. It wasn't a victory, but it wasn't a defeat either. Back at the penthouse, Heitor found Pedro and Clara in the living room. They were surrounded by shopping bags from various toy stores and children's boutiques. "We may have gone a bit overboard," Clara admitted with a smile. "But he needed so many things." Pedro rushed to Heitor, excited to show him a new robot toy. For a moment, seeing his son's genuine joy, Heitor forgot about the board meeting and all its pressures. "Did you have fun today?" he asked, sitting down beside Pedro on the couch. Pedro nodded enthusiastically. "Clara took me to the biggest toy store ever, and we had pizza for lunch. Real pizza, not frozen." Heitor laughed, a weight lifting from his shoulders. "I'm glad you had a good day." After dinner, while Pedro was playing with his new toys, Heitor called Ricardo to strategize. They needed a plan to counter Eduardo's influence on the board. "We should look into Eduardo's recent activities," Ricardo suggested. "He's been too eager to push you out. There might be something there." Heitor agreed, but his mind was divided. Part of him wanted to fight with all his might to keep control of his company, but another part, a growing part, wondered if it was worth the battle. For the first time in his life, something mattered more than business success. Later that evening, as Heitor was tucking Pedro into bed, the boy asked a question that caught him off guard. "Dad, were you happy when I was born?" Heitor sat on the edge of the bed, thinking carefully about his answer. "Yes, I was. Your mother and I were very young and we didn't have much money, but when I first held you, I felt like the richest man in the world." "Then why did you leave?" Pedro's voice was small but direct. Heitor took a deep breath. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I wanted to give you and your mother a better life. I thought if I could make enough money, we could have everything we ever wanted. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what really mattered." "The money?" Pedro asked. "No," Heitor said softly. "You and your mother, family, love. Those are the things that really matter." Pedro seemed to consider this, then said, "Mom always said you had a good heart, but a confused head." Heitor laughed, tears pricking his eyes. "She was right. Sophia was always right about me." As Pedro drifted off to sleep, Heitor sat watching him, marveling at this second chance he'd been given. The next morning, The doorbell rang early. Heitor opened the door to find Miranda standing there, looking immaculate as always, but with a hardness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "I came to collect some personal items," she announced, walking past him without waiting for an invitation. Heitor followed her into the master bedroom. "Miranda, can we talk about this reasonably?" She turned to face him, her expression cold. "So there's nothing to discuss. You've made your choice clear. It's not about choosing between you and Pedro. He's my son. He needs me." Miranda began gathering jewelry from her dresser. "And what about what I need? I married a successful, respected businessman, not some guilt-ridden father with a child from the slums." "Don't talk about him that way," Heitor warned, his voice low and dangerous. Miranda paused, studying his face. "You know, I always wondered what would make you show real emotion. Now I know. It takes a dirty little boy from your past to bring out your passion." Before Heitor could respond, Pedro appeared in the doorway, having overheard everything. His eyes were wide with hurt. "Pedro," Heitor started, but the boy turned and ran down the hall. Heitor shot Miranda a look of pure anger, then went after his son. He found Pedro in his room, shoving clothes into his old backpack. "What are you doing?" Heitor asked gently. "I'm leaving," Pedro said, his voice choked with tears. "I'm causing too many problems." Heitor knelt beside him, taking the backpack away. "No, you're not leaving. This is your home now. But your wife hates me, and your company is in trouble because of me. I heard you on the phone with Ricardo." Heitor pulled Pedro into a tight hug. "Listen to me. None of that is your fault. Miranda and I had problems long before you came. And as for the company, let them worry about their stock prices. You're what matters to me now." Pedro pulled back, looking skeptical. "Really? But you worked so hard for your company." "Some things are worth more than money or success," Heitor said, wiping away his son's tears. "You taught me that." When they returned to the living room, Miranda was waiting with her lawyer, a stern-looking woman with a briefcase. "We need to discuss terms," the lawyer began, but Heitor cut her off. "Not now, and not in front of my son." Miranda smirked. "Still playing the devoted father? How touching. I wonder how long it will last." Pedro stepped forward, surprising everyone. "He is my father, and he's not going to leave me again." The certainty in the boy's voice left Miranda momentarily speechless. She recovered quickly, though, and turned to her lawyer. "Send the papers to his office. I want this resolved quickly." After they left, Heitor looked at Pedro with newfound respect. "That was brave of you." Pedro shrugged, but there was a small smile on his face. "She's not very nice." Heitor laughed. "No, she's not. But you know what? I think we're going to be just fine without her." The following week brought new challenges. Pedro started at an exclusive private school where the children of the wealthy and powerful were educated. Heitor had hoped it would help Pedro adjust to his new life, but the transition wasn't smooth. "They all stare at me," Pedro complained after his third day, "and nobody wants to be my partner in class." Heitor felt helpless. He could buy his son anything money could afford, but he couldn't buy him acceptance or friendship. "Give it time," he advised. "They just need to get to know you." But time didn't seem to help. After 2 weeks, Pedro was still eating lunch alone and coming home with no stories about friends or games played at recess. One afternoon, Heitor picked Pedro up from school instead of sending the driver. As they walked to the car, he noticed a group of well-dressed parents watching them and whispering. "Is that them?" Pedro asked quietly. "The ones who won't let their kids play with me." Heitor felt a surge of protective anger. "Most likely. Don't worry about them." "But I do worry," Pedro admitted. "Everyone at school knows about the news stories. They say I'm only here because you feel guilty." Heitor stopped walking and knelt to look his son in the eye. "Listen to me. You're here because you belong with me, because I love you, not because of guilt." "Do you really love me?" Pedro asked, his voice barely a whisper. "With all my heart," Heitor assured him. "From the moment you were born, and every day since, even when we were apart." A small smile tugged at Pedro's lips. "I think I'm starting to love you too. Is that okay?" Heitor felt his heart swell. "That's more than okay. That's everything." As they drove home, Heitor made a decision. The exclusive school, the penthouse, the whole lifestyle. None of it was making Pedro happy. Perhaps it was time for a different approach. That evening, Heitor called Ricardo to his penthouse for a serious conversation. "I'm thinking about stepping down as CEO," Heitor announced as they sat in his home office. Ricardo nearly choked on his scotch. "What? Because of Eduardo's threats? We can fight him, Heitor. We've been gathering information and I think he's up to something with that new Asian acquisition." Heitor shook his head. "It's not about Eduardo, it's about Pedro. He's not happy, Ricardo. This life, my life, it's not working for him." "What are you saying?" Ricardo asked, bewildered. "I'm saying maybe it's time for a change, a real change. Away from all this." Heitor gestured to the opulent surroundings. Ricardo set down his glass. "Heitor, you've worked 20 years to build this company, to build this life. You can't just walk away." "Can't I?" Heitor challenged. "What's the point of all this success if I can't make my own son happy? If I can't be the father he deserves? So what's your plan? Sell everything and move to some small town?" Heitor smiled. "Something like that. Sofia and Pedro lived in a coastal town called Praia Azul. Pedro was happy there. Maybe we could be happy there too." Ricardo looked at his friend as if he'd lost his mind. "You're serious about this?" "I'm considering it," Heitor admitted. "Pedro needs stability, friends. A normal life, not this circus." Before Ricardo could respond, Clara entered the office with a worried expression. "Sir, there's a woman here to see you. She says her name is Luisa Mendez, and that she's Sofia's sister, Pedro's aunt." Heitor and Ricardo exchanged surprised looks. Sofia had never mentioned having a sister. "Show her in," Heitor instructed. A moment later, a woman in her early 30s entered the office. She had the same warm eyes as Sofia, but a hardness to her expression that made Heitor uneasy. "So you're the famous Heitor Albuquerque," Luisa said, her voice laced with contempt. "The man who abandoned my sister and nephew." Heitor stood. "I didn't. To know Sofia had a sister." "There's a lot you don't know," Luisa replied coldly, "like the fact that Sofia worked 2 jobs to support Pedro after you left, or that when she got sick, she couldn't afford the treatments that might have saved her life." Each word was like a knife to Heitor's heart. "I sent money," he said weakly. "For the first year, yes. Then nothing." Luisa crossed her arms. "I've been living abroad. When I finally made it back to Brazil and found out Sofia had died, I went looking for Pedro. The neighbors told me what happened." "Pedro is adjusting well," Heitor said defensively. "He's with his father now." Luisa laughed bitterly. "His father? You stopped being his father the day you walked out that door. I'm here to take Pedro home where he belongs." Heitor felt the room spin. "You can't do that. I'm his father. I have rights." "Rights?" Luisa's voice rose. "What about Pedro's right to a stable home, to people who won't abandon him when something better comes along?" Ricardo stepped forward. "Perhaps we should all calm down and discuss this rationally," but Luisa wasn't finished. "I've already spoken to a lawyer. I'm filing for custody. Pedro belongs with family who love him, not with a stranger who happens to share his DNA." "Where were you when Sofia died?" Heitor challenged. "When Pedro was living with his grandmother. You're just as much a stranger to him as I am." Luisa's face flushed with anger. "I was working overseas, sending money home when I could. I didn't know how bad things had gotten, but at least I have a connection to the life he knows." "What do you have? Money, a fancy apartment? Those things don't make a home." Before Heitor could respond, they heard a small gasp from the doorway. Pedro stood there, his face pale with shock. "You want to take me away?" he asked Luisa, his voice trembling. Luisa's expression softened immediately. "Pedro, I'm your Aunt Luisa. Your mother's sister. I want what's best for you." Pedro looked from Luisa to Heitor, confusion and fear clear in his eyes. "But I just found my dad. I don't want to leave him." Heitor crossed the room and put his arm around Pedro's shoulders. "No one is taking you anywhere you don't want to go, I promise." Luisa watched them, her expression conflicted. "Pedro, I know this is confusing, but I knew your mother. I can tell you stories about her, help you remember her. We're family." "So is my dad," Pedro said quietly but firmly. The tension in the room was palpable. Finally, Ricardo cleared his throat. It's getting late. Perhaps we should continue this discussion tomorrow, when everyone has had time to rest and think. Louisa reluctantly agreed, but her parting words to Heitor made it clear the battle was just beginning. This isn't over. Pedro belongs with his mother's family. After she left, Heitor sat with Pedro on the couch, trying to reassure him. Don't worry, she can't take you away from me. But as he said the words, Heitor wasn't entirely sure they were true. What if a judge looked at his track record as a father and found him wanting? What if his wealth and power weren't enough to keep his son? For the first time since building his empire, Heitor felt truly vulnerable. And as he held his son close, he realized that the fight for his company paled in comparison to the fight that now lay ahead. The fight to keep Pedro in his life. The morning sun cast long shadows across the kitchen as Heitor made breakfast for Pedro. It had been 3 days since Louisa's unexpected appearance, and the threat of losing his son had consumed Heitor's thoughts. "Do I have to go to school today?" Pedro asked, pushing his scrambled eggs around his plate. Heitor studied his son's face, noting the dark circles under his eyes. "Not if you don't want to. We could do something fun instead." Pedro looked up, surprised. "Really? But you always say education is important." "It is," Heitor agreed, sitting down beside him. "But so is being happy. And I don't think that school is making you happy." A small smile appeared on Pedro's face. "Can we go to the beach? Mom used to take me to the beach all the time in Praia Azul." The mention of Sofia and their old hometown sent a pang through Heitor's heart. "The beach sounds perfect. Let me make a few calls first." In his office, Heitor called Ricardo to let him know he wouldn't be coming into the office again today. "This is the 3rd day this week, Heitor," Ricardo warned. "Eduardo is using your absence to sway more board members to his side." "Let him try," Heitor replied dismissively. "I've been thinking about what we discussed, about stepping down." Ricardo sighed heavily. "Don't make any hasty decisions. At least meet with your lawyer first. Louisa filed the custody papers yesterday." Heitor felt his stomach drop. "Already? That was fast. She's not wasting any time. The good news is your lawyer thinks her case is weak. You're Pedro's biological father, and you have resources to provide for him. But what? But the judge will consider what's in Pedro's best interest, his stability, his emotional well-being. Your history of abandonment won't help your case." After hanging up, Heitor leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of his past mistakes. How could he convince a judge that he was a fit father when he had walked away from his son for 8 years? The beach was less crowded than Heitor expected for a weekday. He and Pedro walked barefoot along the shoreline, the cool water washing over their feet. "This isn't the same as our beach," Pedro observed, looking out at the ocean. "The sand is different." "We could go to Praia Azul someday," Heitor suggested. "Would you like that?" Pedro's face lit up. "Really? Could we visit Mom's grave too? I haven't been there since Grandma got too sick to." "Take me." Heitor felt a lump in his throat. "Of course we can. We should bring flowers. What were her favorites?" "Sunflowers," Pedro answered immediately. She said they were happy flowers that always looked for the light. They spent the morning building sandcastles and collecting shells. For a few hours, the custody battle and company troubles seemed far away. Pedro laughed more than Heitor had heard since he'd come to live with him. As they sat eating ice cream on a bench overlooking the water, Pedro asked, "Dad, if Aunt Louisa takes me away, will I ever see you again?" The question caught Heitor off guard. "No one is taking you away, I promise. But what if they do? What if a judge says I have to go with her?" Heitor put his arm around his son's shoulders. "Then I'll visit you every day. I'll move to wherever you are. Nothing will keep me from being part of your life again." Pedro leaned against him. "I wish Mom could see us now. She always said you'd come back someday." "I wish I had come back sooner," Heitor admitted quietly. "I missed so much." "It's okay," Pedro said with a wisdom beyond his years. "You're here now." On the drive home, Heitor made a decision. It was time to take control of the situation, to be proactive rather than reactive. He wouldn't let anyone, not Eduardo, not Miranda, and certainly not Louisa, take away this second chance with his son. The next morning, Heitor and Pedro were having breakfast when the doorbell rang. Clara opened the door to find Luisa standing there with a stern-faced woman in a business suit. "Mr. Albuquerque," the woman announced as they entered the penthouse. "I'm Angela Rocha, the court-appointed social worker assigned to evaluate Pedro's living situation." Heitor stood, extending his hand. "I wasn't aware we had an appointment." "Surprise visits provide a more accurate picture," Angela explained, not taking his hand. "I hope you don't mind." Luisa smiled triumphantly behind the social worker. "We just want what's best for Pedro." Pedro moved closer to Heitor, eyeing the visitors warily. "Of course," Heitor said smoothly, trying to hide his anxiety. "We have nothing to hide. Pedro and I were just having breakfast. Would you care to join us?" Angela declined, but spent the next hour inspecting the penthouse and asking Pedro questions, while Heitor hovered nearby, not allowed to intervene. "And do you have friends here, Pedro?" Angela asked, making notes on her clipboard. Pedro glanced at Heitor before answering. "Not yet. The kids at school don't really talk to me." "I see. And what about activities? Sports, hobbies?" Pedro shrugged. "We went to the beach yesterday, that was fun. But no regular activities, no structure to your days." Before Pedro could answer, Heitor interrupted. "Pedro has only been living with me for a few weeks. We're still establishing routines." Angela gave him a disapproving look. "Mr. Albuquerque, I'd appreciate if you'd let Pedro answer for himself." After Angela and Luisa left, Heitor called his lawyer immediately. "They're trying to make me look bad," he explained, pacing his office. "The social worker barely acknowledged me and kept asking Pedro leading questions." "It's a standard tactic," his lawyer assured him, "but we need to be prepared. The hearing is set for next month. In the meantime, I suggest you create as much stability for Pedro as possible. Routines, activities, maybe even a child psychologist to help with the transition." Heitor hung up, feeling overwhelmed. He'd built a billion-dollar company from nothing, navigated cutthroat business deals, and faced down the toughest competitors. But none of that had prepared him for the challenge of proving he could be a good father. That afternoon, Ricardo arrived at the penthouse with a serious expression. "We have a problem. Eduardo called an emergency board meeting without notifying you. They're voting tomorrow on whether to remove you as CEO." Heitor fell into a chair, stunned. "Can they do that?" "With enough votes, yes. And Eduardo has been busy while you've been focused on Pedro. He's convinced several key shareholders that your personal drama is hurting the company." Heitor rubbed his temples, feeling a headache coming on. "So what are our options?" "Fight back," Ricardo said firmly. "Show up tomorrow with a solid plan to address the PR issues. Convince them you can still lead the company while being a father to Pedro." "And if I can't?" "Convince them." Ricardo's expression softened. "Then you lose the company you built from the ground up." After Ricardo left, Heitor found Pedro in his room, drawing pictures. "That looks nice," he said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "What is it?" "It's our house in Playa Azul," Pedro explained, pointing to a small blue house by the ocean. "And that's Mom, you and me." Heitor studied the picture, a family that never had the chance to be together. "Pedro, I need to ask you something important. If you could choose, would you rather live here with me or go back to Playa Azul with your Aunt Luisa?" Pedro looked up, his eyes serious. "I want to be with you, but I miss home too. I miss my friends, and my school and our house." An idea began to form in Heitor's mind. What if we could have both? What if we moved to Playa Azul together? Pedro's eyes widened. "You would do that? But what about your big company?" "Some things are more important than business," Heitor said, the words feeling right as he spoke them. "Like family." For the first time since Pedro had come into his life, Heitor felt clarity about what needed to be done. The boardroom fell silent as Heitor entered the next morning. Eduardo sat at the head of the table, Heitor's usual seat, and didn't bother to hide his smug smile. "Heitor, how kind of you to join us," Eduardo said. "We were just discussing the leadership transition." "Were you?" Heitor replied calmly, taking the only empty chair. "That seems premature considering I'm still the CEO and largest individual shareholder." "For now," Eduardo retorted. "But after today's vote, That may change. Hator looked around the table at the faces of people he'd worked with for years. Some couldn't meet his eyes. Others looked resigned, as if the outcome was already decided. "Before you vote," Hator said, addressing the whole room, "I'd like to make an announcement. I've decided to step down as CEO of Albuquerque Group." Gasps filled the room. Even Eduardo looked stunned. "But not for the reasons you think," Hator continued. "I'm stepping down because I've realized what really matters in life. It's not stock prices or profit margins. It's family. My son needs me, and I intend to be there for him in a way I wasn't before." "A touching speech," Eduardo said after recovering from his surprise. "But it doesn't change the damage your scandal has done to this company." Hator smiled. "You're right, Eduardo. The company has suffered, but not because of my reunion with my son. The real damage has been done by someone in this room who's been deliberately tanking our stock by selling large blocks of shares while simultaneously spreading rumors to the press." The room erupted in confused murmurs. Ricardo distributed folders to each board member. "These are trading records from the past 2 weeks," Ricardo explained. "They show a pattern of large sell-offs from an offshore account that, when traced back, links directly to Eduardo Santos." All eyes turned to Eduardo, whose face had gone pale. "That's absurd," he sputtered. "These records are fabricated." "The SEC doesn't think so," Hator replied coolly. "They're very interested in talking to you about market manipulation." For the next hour, the board meeting transformed into a heated debate about Eduardo's actions. By the end, it was Eduardo, not Hator, who was voted out, not just as a potential CEO, but from the board entirely. As people filed out of the room, Ricardo approached Hator. "That was masterful. You could have destroyed him weeks ago with this information. Why wait until now?" Hator gathered his papers. "Because it didn't matter until now. I've made my decision, Ricardo. I'm still stepping down. I'd like you to take over as CEO." Ricardo stared at him in disbelief. "Me? But this company is your life's work." "It was," Hator corrected. "Now my son is my life's work." When Hator returned to the penthouse, he found Pedro and Clara in the kitchen making cookies. "How did your meeting go?" Clara asked, wiping flour from her hands. "Better than expected," Hator replied, stealing a bit of cookie dough. "Pedro, how would you feel about going to Praia Azul this weekend? Not just to visit, but to look at houses?" Pedro's face lit up. "You really meant it. We're really going to move there." "If that's what you want," Hator confirmed, "I think it would be good for both of us to have a fresh start somewhere that feels like home to—" "You!" Pedro launched himself into Hator's arms, covering his suit with flour and chocolate. Hator didn't mind a bit. The next day, Hator's lawyer called with unexpected news. "The judge wants to meet with you and Luisa together, informally, before the hearing. It's unusual, but it could work in our favor." The meeting was set for that afternoon at the judge's chambers. When Hator arrived, Luisa was already there, sitting stiffly in a chair across from the judge's desk. Judge Carmela. Santos was a stern-looking woman in her 60s, with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Thank you both for coming," she began. "I've reviewed the initial filings in this case, and I have concerns." Hator and Luisa exchanged nervous glances. "My concern," the judge continued, "is that neither of you seems to be putting Pedro's needs first. Ms. Mendez, you've been absent from Pedro's life for years, yet you claim to know what's best for him. And Mr. Albuquerque, you abandoned your son for 8 years, only to suddenly decide to be a father when it became public. That's not fair," Hator protested. "I've been trying to make up for my mistakes. And I was working overseas," Luisa added defensively. "I didn't know Sophia had died until recently," the judge held up her hand. "I'm not interested in excuses. I'm interested in what's best for Pedro moving forward. So, before we proceed with a formal hearing, I want both of you to answer one question. What does Pedro want?" The question hung in the air. Hator was the first to speak. "Pedro wants stability. He wants to feel safe and loved. He misses his home in Praia Azul, his school, his friends." "And you think you can provide that?" the judge asked skeptically. "I'm moving to Praia Azul," Hator announced, surprising both the judge and Luisa. "I've stepped down as CEO of my company. I'm buying a house there so Pedro can return to his old school and be near his friends." Luisa looked stunned. "You're giving up everything?" Your company, your lifestyle. I don't believe it. Believe it, Hater said firmly. Nothing is more important to me than being a father to my son. Judge Santos studied Hater's face, searching for any sign of deception. That's a dramatic change. Mr. Albuquerque, Pedro has changed me, Heitor said simply. He's reminded me of what's truly valuable in life. The judge turned to Luisa. And you, Miss Mendez? Would you be willing to make similar sacrifices for Pedro? Luisa shifted uncomfortably. I love my nephew, but my life is in Europe now. I have a career there. I was planning to take Pedro back with me. Uprooting him from everything familiar? The judge asked. I thought it would be a fresh start, Luisa stammered. Judge Santos leaned back in her chair. Here's what I'm going to propose. The formal hearing will proceed as scheduled, but in the meantime, I want you both to spend time with Pedro together, not as adversaries, but as two adults who supposedly care about his well-being. See if you can come to an arrangement that truly puts him first. As they left the judge's chambers, Luisa stopped Hater in the hallway. Is it true? You're really moving to Praia Azul? Yes, Hater confirmed. We're going this weekend to look at houses. Pedro needs to be somewhere he feels at home. Luisa studied him with new eyes. Sophia always said you were a good man at heart. I never believed her, but maybe she was right. She was right about many things, Hater admitted. I just realized it too late. After a moment's hesitation, Luisa said, I'd like to come with you this weekend. To Praia Azul, if that's okay with Pedro. Hater was surprised but nodded. I think he'd like that. You can tell him stories about Sophia, about your childhood together. For the first time, a genuine understanding passed between them. They were no longer enemies fighting over Pedro, but two people who loved him, trying to do what was best for him. The coastal town of Praia Azul was exactly as Hater remembered it, a small, picturesque place with colorful houses and friendly people. As they drove through the main street, Pedro pointed out landmarks from his childhood. That's my school, and there's the ice cream shop where Mom used to take me on Sundays, and that's Rosa's store. She always gave me a piece of candy when Mom bought groceries. Luisa, sitting in the back seat, added her own memories. Your mother and I used to swim at the cove past those rocks. We'd stay in the water until our fingers wrinkled like prunes. They visited Sophia's grave first, bringing the sunflowers Pedro had insisted on. As Pedro arranged the flowers, Hater and Luisa stood back, giving him space. He's so much like her, Luisa observed quietly. The same gentle spirit, the same quiet strength. Hater nodded, watching his son with a lump in his throat. I see her in him every day, in his smile, in his kindness. You really love him, don't you? Luisa asked, searching Hater's face. More than anything, Hater replied without hesitation. More than I ever thought possible. Luisa was quiet for a moment. I came back to Brazil angry at you for abandoning them, angry at myself for not being here when Sophia needed me. I wanted someone to blame, and you were the perfect target. I deserved your anger, Hater acknowledged. What I did was unforgivable, but Pedro has forgiven you, Luisa pointed out. And Sophia. She never stopped believing you'd come back someday. As they watched Pedro gently talking to his mother's gravestone, Luisa made a decision. I'm dropping the custody case. Hater turned to her in surprise. What? Pedro belongs here, in Praia Azul, with his friends and his memories of Sophia. And he belongs with you. I can see that now. Tears filled Hater's eyes. Thank you, Luisa. You don't know what that means to me. But I'm not disappearing from his life, she warned. I want to be part of it, to visit often, to get to know my nephew. You'll always be welcome, Hater promised. Pedro needs his family, all of his family. Later that day, they visited 3 houses for sale in town. The one Pedro loved most was a blue house on a hill overlooking the ocean, not unlike the one he had drawn in his picture. It's perfect, Pedro declared, running from room to room. Can we really live here? Hater laughed, caught up in his son's excitement. If this is the one you want, then yes, we can live here. It needs some work, the real estate agent warned. The previous owners left years ago, but Hater could already see the potential, not just in the house, but in the life they could build here. A simple life, far from the corporate towers and penthouse apartments, but rich in the ways that truly mattered. That evening, as they ate dinner at a small local restaurant where everyone greeted Pedro by name, Heitor felt a contentment he hadn't experienced in years. The decision to leave his old life behind no longer seemed like a sacrifice. It felt like coming home. "So," Luisa said as they finished their meal, "when do you plan to move?" "As soon as possible," Heitor replied. "I've already started the paperwork for Pedro to return to his old school next month." "What about your company?" she asked. "Ricardo will do a fine job as CEO. I'll still be on the board, but not involved in day-to-day operations." Pedro, who had been listening quietly, asked, "Won't you miss it, Dad, being rich and important?" Heitor smiled at his son. "I'm still rich, Pedro, just in different ways now. And as for being important, being your father is the most important job I've ever had." As they walked back to their hotel along the moonlit beach, Pedro ran ahead, chasing waves and collecting shells. Heitor and Luisa followed behind, their earlier animosity replaced by a tentative friendship. "I never thought I'd say this," Luisa admitted, "but I think you're going to be a good father to him." Heitor watched his son silhouetted against the ocean. "I hope so. I have a lot to make up for." "Sophia would be happy," Luisa said softly, "seeing you two together like this. It's what she always wanted." The mention of Sophia brought a bittersweet pang to Heitor's heart. "I wish she could see him grow up. She did such an amazing job with him all on her own." "She wasn't entirely alone," Luisa reminded him. "She had this town, these people. They became her family when you left." Heitor nodded, acknowledging the truth in her words. "And now they'll be our family too." As Pedro ran back to them, his hands full of seashells and his face glowing with happiness, Heitor felt the last pieces of his old self, the ambitious, ruthless businessman who valued wealth above all else, fall away. In its place was something new, a father who would do anything for his son, a man who had finally found what truly mattered in life. The three of them walked together under the stars, not yet a perfect family, but perhaps the beginning of one. And for now that was enough. 3 months had passed since Heitor and Pedro moved to Praia Azul. The blue house on the hill had been transformed from an abandoned property into a warm home filled with laughter and life. Simple furniture replaced the designer pieces from the penthouse. Family photos, many rescued from Sophia's old belongings, lined the walls. Pedro's drawings were proudly displayed on the refrigerator. On this particular morning, Heitor stood on the porch watching the sunrise over the ocean. The salty breeze ruffled his hair, which had grown longer since he left his corporate life behind. He wore a simple t-shirt and shorts, a far cry from the tailored suits that had once been his daily uniform. "Dad, I'm going to be late." Pedro called from inside, his voice edged with excitement rather than worry. Today was a special day. Pedro's school was holding a father-son fishing competition, and they had been practicing for weeks. Heitor smiled as he went back inside. Pedro was at the kitchen table wolfing down breakfast and dressed in his lucky fishing hat, a faded blue cap that had once belonged to Sophia's father. "Slow down," Heitor laughed. "The fish aren't going anywhere." Pedro grinned, his mouth full of cereal. "But all the good spots will be taken if we're late." Life in Praia Azul had agreed with both of them. Pedro had slipped back into his old school with surprising ease, quickly reconnecting with former friends and making new ones. His nightmares had stopped, and the wary look that had haunted his eyes in the penthouse had disappeared. For Heitor, the transition had been more challenging, but ultimately rewarding. He had traded board meetings for community council gatherings, financial reports for fishing almanacs, and power lunches for picnics on the beach. He still worked remotely as a board member for the Albuquerque group, but most of his time was devoted to Pedro and their new life together. Not everyone had understood his choice. Miranda had laughed when he told her his plans, certain he would return to the city within weeks, bored and regretful. Eduardo had called it a midlife crisis, a temporary madness that would pass. But Ricardo had surprised him by supporting his decision, even visiting monthly to update him on company matters and spend time with Pedro, whom he now treated like a nephew. "Have you packed the sandwiches?" Pedro asked, breaking into Heitor's thoughts. All done, Heitor assured him, pointing to the cooler by the door. Ham and cheese for you, tuna for me, and plenty of juice. Pedro beamed. We're going to win today. I can feel it. As they drove to the harbor in Heitor's new modest SUV, the Ferrari had been sold months ago, they passed through the town square. People waved and called out greetings. Here, Heitor wasn't the billionaire CEO, but simply Pedro's father, a newcomer, who had gradually earned the community's acceptance. At the harbor, dozens of fathers and sons were preparing their boats. Some had fancy equipment, but most made do with simple rods and reels passed down through generations. Heitor, Pedro, over here, called a familiar voice. Luisa stood beside a small fishing boat, waving enthusiastically. Beside her was Ricardo, looking decidedly out of place in his city clothes. Aunt Luisa, Pedro ran to her, throwing his arms around her waist. Did you bring it? Luisa laughed, ruffling his hair. Of course I did. Your mother's lucky fishing lure. She always swore it was magic. True to her word, Luisa had become a regular part of their lives. Her initial anger toward Heitor had transformed into a cautious friendship, bound together by their shared love for Pedro and memories of Sofia. I didn't know you were coming, Heitor said, greeting Ricardo with a handshake that turned into a hug. I wouldn't miss Pedro's big day, Ricardo replied. Besides, I have news about the company that couldn't wait. Business can wait until tomorrow, Heitor said firmly. Today is about family. Ricardo looked momentarily surprised, then nodded with understanding. The old Heitor would never have put business on hold, not for anything or anyone. As the competition began, boats spread out across the bay. Pedro insisted on handling the fishing rod himself, his small face serious with concentration. Heitor sat beside him, offering guidance but letting his son take the lead. Mom and I used to fish. Here, Pedro said, watching his line bob in the water. She was really good at it. I remember, Heitor said softly. She once caught a fish so big I couldn't even reel it in. Pedro looked at him curiously. You went fishing with Mom? Heitor nodded, his mind drifting back to simpler days. When we first met, we used to come out here almost every weekend. Your mother loved the ocean. She said it made her feel free. Did you love her? Pedro asked, the question innocent but direct. Heitor considered his answer carefully. I did. We were very young, and I didn't understand then what real love meant. The kind that lasts through hard times. But yes, I loved her. Pedro seemed satisfied with this answer and returned his attention to his fishing line. I think she still loves you too. Grandma always said Mum kept your picture by her bed even after you left. The simple statement hit Heitor like a physical blow. All those years, while he had been building his empire and eventually marrying Miranda, Sofia had remained faithful to his memory. The thought filled him with both gratitude and deep regret. Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden tug on Pedro's line. I got something, he shouted, his face lighting up with excitement. Heitor moved to help, but Pedro waved him off. I can do it, Dad. And he did. After a brief but intense struggle, Pedro reeled in a respectable-sized sea bass, beaming with pride as Heitor captured the moment with his phone camera. By the end of the competition, they had caught 3 fish, not enough to win, but enough to make Pedro proud of their effort. As they returned to shore, Heitor realized he hadn't felt this content in years. The simple joy of spending a day on the water with his son was worth more than all the business deals he had ever closed. Back on land, the town held a fish fry with all the day's catch. Tables were set up in the square, and everyone shared food and stories as the sun began to set. Heitor found himself drawn into conversations with local fishermen, school teachers and shopkeepers, people whose names and faces he now knew, people who had become neighbors and friends. You look happy, Luisa observed, joining him as he watched Pedro play soccer with some school friends in the square. More relaxed than I've ever seen you. I am, Heitor admitted. Happier than I've been in a very long time. Sofia would be proud, Luisa said. Of both of you. The mention of Sofia no longer brought just pain. Now it also carried warmth and a sense of connection that Heitor cherished. I hope so. I'm trying to be the father she always believed I could be. As the evening wound down, Ricardo pulled Heitor aside for a private conversation. I know you said business could wait, but there's something you should know. Eduardo is making another play for control of the company. Heitor sighed. What's he doing now? He's approaching shareholders, offering to buy their stocks at a premium. He's particularly targeting your allies on the board. And you want me to come back and fight him? Heitor guessed. Ricardo hesitated. The old me would have said yes. But seeing you here, seeing how happy Pedro is, he shook his head. I think I can handle Eduardo. I just wanted you to know what was happening. Heitor clapped a hand on his friend's shoulder. I trust you, Ricardo. The company is in good hands. With you as CEO. My life is here now with Pedro. As they walked back to join the others, Heitor spotted a familiar face in the crowd, one that didn't belong in the small coastal town. Miranda stood at the edge of the square, looking expensive and out of place in her designer clothes and high heels. What is she doing here? Louisa whispered, noticing her at the same time. I have no idea, Heitor replied, making his way toward his ex-wife. Miranda's eyes widened as she took in his casual appearance. Well, this is certainly rustic, she said by way of greeting. I almost didn't recognize you. Miranda, Heitor said evenly, this is a surprise. Not a pleasant one, I gather, she replied with a tight smile. Don't worry, I won't stay long, I just needed your signature on these. She handed him a folder of legal documents. The final divorce papers. My lawyer has been trying to reach you for weeks. I've been busy, Heitor said, taking the folder without looking at it. How did you find me? Your old secretary, Clara. She was quite helpful once I explained. The urgency. Miranda glanced around the town square with barely disguised disdain. So this is your new life? Fishing and town festivals? I can't believe you gave up everything for this. Before Heitor could respond, Pedro spotted them and came running over. Dad, we won third place in the junior division. He stopped short when he saw Miranda, his expression turning wary. Oh, hello? Miranda seemed taken aback by the change in Pedro. Gone was the timid, uncertain boy from the penthouse. In his place stood a confident, happy child with sun-tanned skin and bright eyes. Hello, Pedro, she said, her voice softer than before. You look well. I am well, Pedro replied with simple honesty. Dad and I are really happy here. You should try the fish. I caught it myself. A flicker of something, regret perhaps, crossed Miranda's face. That's nice. But I can't stay. I have a flight back to the city tonight. I'll walk you to your car, Heitor offered, handing the folder to Ricardo. Can you keep an eye on Pedro for a minute? As they walked away from the celebration, Miranda broke the awkward silence. He seems different, happier. We both are, Heitor said. This place has been good for us, and you really don't miss any of it. The power, the luxury, the respect. Heitor considered the question seriously. Sometimes I miss the challenge of big business decisions, but no, I don't miss the rest. I've found something more valuable here. They reached her sleek rental car, parked at the edge of town. Miranda turned to face him, her expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. I thought you were having a breakdown when you decided to move here. I was so sure you'd come crawling. Back once you realized what you'd given up. I know what I've given up, Heitor said gently. And I know what I've gained. No regrets, Miranda. She studied his face, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. I never really knew you, did I? The real you? Probably not, Heitor admitted. Just as I never really knew you. We were together for all the wrong reasons. Miranda nodded slowly. Perhaps. She opened her car door, then paused. For what it's worth, I think you've made the right choice. Pedro needs you more than the business world does. The admission surprised Heitor. Thank you for saying that. As Miranda drove away, Heitor felt the last ties to his old life leaving with her. There was a sense of closure, of one chapter ending completely as another continued to unfold. When he's at dinner, he returned to the square. He found Pedro sitting with Louisa and Ricardo, all three laughing together like the family they had somehow become. Is she gone? Pedro asked as Heitor joined them. Yes, she's gone, Hator confirmed, ruffling his son's hair, and we have divorce papers to sign, but that can wait until tomorrow. Are you sad? Pedro asked, his perceptive eyes studying his father's face. Hator smiled genuinely. Not at all, I have everything I need right here. The next morning, Hator woke early as usual and went to the kitchen to start breakfast. To his surprise, Pedro was already up, sitting at the table with one of Sophia's old photo albums. Couldn't sleep? Hator asked, concerned. Pedro shook his head. I had a dream about Mom. It was a good dream. She was happy that we're together. Hator sat down beside his son, looking at the photos of Sophia. Young, beautiful, always smiling. Despite the hardships she had faced raising Pedro alone. I wish you could have known her better, Pedro said, his fingers tracing Sophia's face in one of the pictures. She was the best mom ever. I wish that too, Hator said softly. But she lives on in you, Pedro. I see her in your smile, in your kindness, in the way you face challenges without giving up. Pedro looked up at his father. Do I have anything from you? Hator laughed. Your stubbornness, definitely. And maybe your love of the ocean. I used to swim for hours when I was your age. They sat in comfortable silence, turning the pages of the album together. When they reached the last page, a folded piece of paper fell out. What's this? Hator asked, picking it up. Pedro unfolded it carefully. It was a letter, written in Sophia's handwriting, dated just 2 months before she died. It's addressed to you, Dad, Pedro said, handing it to him with wide eyes. Hator's hands trembled slightly as he took the letter. He read it silently first, then aloud for Pedro. To hear. Dear Hator, the doctors say I don't have much time left. I've accepted this, but my heart breaks when I think of leaving Pedro alone. My mother will care for him, but a boy needs his father. I never told you I was sick. Pride, perhaps, or maybe I didn't want your help out of pity. But as the end approaches, I find myself thinking of you often, of the young man I loved and the father Pedro deserves to know. I've never spoken badly of you to our son. I've told him stories of the man I knew, kind, ambitious, with dreams bigger than our small town could hold. I believe that man still exists somewhere inside the successful businessman you've become. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and somehow, miraculously, you and Pedro have found each other. Please love him, Hator, not out of obligation or guilt, but with the open heart I once knew you to have, and know that despite everything, I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day. Forever yours, Sophia. Tears streamed down Hator's face as he finished reading. Pedro moved to his side, leaning against him in silent support. She never gave up on you, Pedro said simply, just like you never gave up on me once you found me. Hator pulled his son into a tight embrace, overcome with emotion. Sophia had given him one final precious gift, her forgiveness and the chance to know and love their son. Summer turned to autumn in Praia Azul. The tourist crowds dwindled and the town settled into a quieter rhythm. Pedro thrived in school, making honor roll and joining the junior swim team. Hator became involved in local business development, using his expertise to help small business owners in the community that had welcomed them. Luisa visited regularly, sometimes staying for weeks at a time in the guest room that had become unofficially hers. Ricardo came once a month, bringing news from the city, but spending most of his visits fishing with Pedro or helping Hator with house projects. One Saturday afternoon, as October painted the trees in golden hues, Hator stood on the beach, watching Pedro and Luisa build an elaborate sandcastle. His phone rang, a rare occurrence these days. Hator Albuquerque, he answered, shielding his eyes from the sun. Mr. Albuquerque, this is Angela Rocha, the social worker assigned to Pedro's case. Hator tensed. He hadn't heard from her since before they moved to Praia Azul. Yes, I remember. What can I do for you? I wanted to let you know that I've submitted my final report to the court. The judge has officially closed the case. Full custody has been granted to you with no conditions. Relief washed over Hator. Thank you for letting me know. I should also tell you, Angela continued, her voice warming slightly, that it's one of the most positive reports I've ever filed. My last visit showed a happy, well-adjusted child in a loving home. You've done well, Mr. Albuquerque. Not many. People successfully change their lives so completely for the sake of a child. After hanging up, Heitor joined Pedro and Luisa on the sand. Who was that? Luisa asked, noticing his expression. The social worker, Heitor replied, still processing the news. The custody case is officially closed. Pedro is legally permanently with me now. Pedro looked up from his sandcastle. Was there ever a chance I wouldn't be? The innocent question brought home to Heitor how close he had come to losing his son. There might have been once, but not anymore, not ever again. That evening, they held an impromptu celebration dinner on the porch overlooking the ocean. Ricardo, who had arrived for his monthly visit, raised a toast. To family, not the one you're born with, but the one you build with love. As the sun set over the water, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Heitor took a moment to truly appreciate how far they had come. 8 months ago, he had been a different man, wealthy and powerful, but empty inside. Pedro had been a forgotten child, yearning for his father's love. Now they were building a life together, healing old wounds and creating new memories. Later, after Pedro had gone to bed, Heitor sat alone on the porch swing, Sophia's letter in his hands. He had read it countless times, finding new meaning in her words with each reading. "I wish you could see him now," he whispered, as if Sophia might somehow hear him. "He's amazing, Sophia, strong and kind and so much like you. I promise I'll be the father he deserves, the man you believed I could be." The ocean breeze carried his words away, but in his heart, Heitor felt a sense of peace. He had been given a second chance to be a father, to love unconditionally, to live with purpose rather than ambition. Inside the blue house on the hill, photos of the past shared space with images of the present. Pedro's first swimming competition, Heitor and Pedro fishing together, Luisa teaching Pedro to dance, Ricardo helping with homework. A family created not by blood alone, but by choice and love. And at the center of it all, a father and son who had found each other against all odds, a forgotten son, and the father who would never forget him again. The next morning, Heitor woke to find Pedro already dressed and eager to start the day. "Can we go to the tide pools? I want to show Ricardo the octopus I found last week." "Of course," Heitor agreed readily. Breakfast first, then tide pools. As they ate together at the kitchen table, Heitor, Pedro, Luisa, and Ricardo, Heitor was struck by how natural it felt, this makeshift family they had created. There was laughter and teasing, plans made and stories shared. It was everything he had never known he wanted, everything he now couldn't imagine living without. After breakfast, as they walked along the shoreline toward the tide pools, Pedro slipped his hand into Heitor's, a small gesture that never failed to fill Heitor's heart with joy. "Dad," Pedro said, looking up at him with serious eyes, "I'm glad you found me that day at your party." Heitor squeezed his son's hand. "So am I, Pedro. So am I." Ahead of them, the ocean stretched endlessly toward the horizon, much like the future that lay before them, unknown but full of promise. Behind them, their footprints marked the sand side by side, father and son walking together at last. And in that moment, Heitor knew with absolute certainty that he had finally found what he had been searching for all his life, without even realizing it. Not success or wealth or power, but the simple, profound joy of being Pedro's father, a joy that no amount of money could ever buy, and that he would never again take for granted. "Race you to the tide pools," Pedro suddenly shouted, breaking free and running ahead. Heitor laughed and ran after him, leaving behind the man he had been and embracing fully the man he had become. A father, first and always, running toward a future bright with love and possibility. The end.